So this chapter starts off with us seeing Izuku like straight up flying over the ocean, and this is something that I've been waiting to see, like Izuku using his multiple quirks in combination to achieve abilities that he otherwise wouldn't have, such as flight. So in order to do this, he's using Nana's float quirk, the third user's Jin quirk, which allows him to like build up kinetic energy and expel it for like a certain motion. And then for like propulsion and balance, he's using, Air Force. And this is great, but it's just too bad that it's happening in the final arc, because we're never really going to get any extended sequences of him doing this stuff aside from just the end here. But don't get me wrong, I'm still grateful that we get to see it at all. But this is coming off of the previous chapter where Izuku, wrapped up his sequence with Toga, and he was instructed by Aizawa to come back to UA to help them against Shigaraki because he was originally supposed to be with that team anyway. He kind of has to get there on his own because Monoma can't activate a warp gate to bring Izuku there, because if Monoma did that, then he would have to deactivate Erasure for a couple seconds, which he currently has on Shigaraki, keeping all of his quirks, mainly DK, at bay. Because in his current, Tetsuo-esque state, if he were to activate DK, he would just, nuke everything. And that brings us to Izuku straight up flying there. But even this is not good enough for Izuku because he feels that he's not going fast enough, and he would like to use Black Whip to sling off of something, to give him more momentum, to bring him back into that faux 100% mode that we saw him use against Nagan. But then the vestige of the second user comes out, and he's like, don't lose your cool. Your decisions are becoming muddled. That gear you're wearing, is it really capable of taking 100% of One For All? It's like, do you plan on just wrecking your equipment before you even get to the battle? So just trying to keep Izuku calm and collected. Then he says something really interesting, because he's like, did you try to activate my meta ability? And he's talking about his quirk, of course, but he refers to it as that because he comes from like 100 years ago or around that time. And that's what people originally used to call quirks. But then Izuku says yes, meaning that he has used this ability off panel. Or maybe he used it like in the series, but it was like hiding in plain sight and we, the audience, weren't aware of it. I'm not really sure. I don't think so, but maybe. Then the second user says, I told you using that would be a last resort. After melding with One For All, our meta abilities have strengthened significantly. And because of that, mine has transformed into a very useful but specific type of power. Something well beyond our control. So that's super intriguing, and I'm sure we all have our own theories on what the second user's quirk could be. I don't know what the popular one is, but at least to me, it seems like it's like, some kind of energy projection or something, mainly because of his like gauntlets and the way that he aimed them back in the flashback when he was saving Yoichi. It seems like his quirk has something to do with that. So if it's not like some kind of energy projection or some kind of projectile thing, then I'm not really sure what it is. And if it is that, then it would make sense that it would be beyond his control, because he would essentially be blasting like this huge Kamehameha out of his hand, which would, be pretty difficult to control at this point, even for Izuku. But going further, we're coming back to the Toga, Uraraka, Tsuyu situation from the previous chapter, and they're kind of just establishing that, like, yes, this is going to be our final battle, essentially. But the interesting thing about this sequence is Toga, like, touching her pouch thing that holds her blood vials, and she says, I'll be what I set out to be. I'll carve my own path. Isn't that right, Jin? Jin, of course, is Twice, and this is in reference to a couple chapters back when it was revealed that Dabi was able to collect some of Twice's blood before he died, and he gave it to Toga, knowing that she would be able to not only become Twice, but because she loves someone, she can also use their ability when she becomes them. And in that panel, we saw like the Sad Man's Parade, which I'm pretty sure is foreshadowing that she is also going to use it, which is probably going to be the Sad Girl's Parade or whatever. And this will be like Uraraka and Tsuyu's like final ultimate battle test. Then we're coming back to Kamino where Dabi and Shoto are, and there's like all this fire around, and we see Dabi hanging off of the All Might statue, and he says, although it's been a while, it's still quite a nostalgic sight. I only began making my moves after seeing that spectacular battle in Hosu City. So this is in reference back to season 2, when the whole big stain battle was happening, and when the League of Villains also sent those 3 Nomus. There was fire there, of course, caused from like the outbreak. But as we mentioned, the whole big stain thing happened there as well. Big incident that inspired many villains to come, such as Dabi and Toga. But also him saying, I only began making my moves after seeing that is pretty interesting, especially after what he says at the end of this chapter, which we'll get into. Dabi has like this tornado of fire around him and Shoto, and It also turns out that Endeavor's 3 sidekicks are there: Burnin, Kido, and Onima. And Onima's talking to Kido and he says like, stay back, you can't take this much heat with that body of yours, right? And Kido's like, I'll be fine, I can control the trajectory of almost anything. And that's because his quirk allows him to like redirect the motion of objects like through his bandages pretty much, or at least I think that's how it works. Because when it was originally revealed what this guy's quirk was, we saw Endeavor like fly through his bandages to make him like move in different directions as he was flying, which is essentially this guy's purpose in the series, just to make Endeavor's flight make sense, I guess. But also like in world of the series, it makes sense too. I mean, that's why Endeavor would recruit him as the sidekick, because otherwise Endeavor can't really fly traditionally. He can only go in like one direction because, you know, he's like being projected by his flames coming off of his feet. But going further, he says, so redirecting the trajectory of the hot air around me has become second nature. So that's how he's able to kind of survive in this environment. But then also his bandages are coming off and we're starting to see a little bit of his face. So that's something. It's just kind of interesting that this guy's like getting development now of all times. It's like, it's fine. But then we're coming back to Shoto and Dabi like having their back and forth, and just Shoto reaffirming that he's there because he wants to be, not because he was ordered. He wants to be the one to take down Dabi. And Dabi's like, well, that just makes you a puppet of dad then. And Shoto's like, well, if that means that he can take his mind off of you and keep being a hero, then so be it. Because, you know, currently he's going against All for One, but Shoto is kind of letting bygones be bygones, since they all have a mutual goal of being heroes and helping society. So for the sake of overall good, he's putting Endeavor's past transgressions behind him, as where Dabi cannot. But going further, Shoto's like, if you were alive all this time, why didn't you come back home? And in the final sequence of the chapter, Dabi says, you want to know that, huh? Well then, I guess I'll tell you then. The reason why my flames never extinguished and surpassed even those of Dad's masterpiece. And then the narration says, the origin of these flames will now be unraveled. So I guess that's what the next chapter is going to be about. Us finally getting the rest of Dabi's backstory, because while we did get most of it, there was still a big piece of connecting tissue that moved us from how we met Dabi originally in the series. Because after Dabi like went to Sokoto Peak and did like the prominence burn or whatever, and like nuked himself essentially, we don't know what happened after that led him to becoming Dabi. We saw Endeavor show up. He was able to find just a piece of his jaw or whatever, but we still didn't see Toya like after the fact, you know, surviving the burns, him getting like the piercings and whatever, but also I guess his rise through the underground possibly, and how he eventually met Girin, because Girin was the one that like contracted him to the League of Villains in the first place along with Toga. But going back to what I was talking about earlier with him saying that he only made his move after the Hosu stuff with Stain, it's like, was he kind of just laying dormant all that time and just being a vagabond or something? And then it was finally seeing the Stain viral video that convinced him to finally take his revenge or something. Maybe not, but we're about to find out in the next chapter. So in this chapter, we're getting the rest of Dabi's backstory, and I guess how it brings everything full circle and makes it relate to almost everything else that's going on, at least on the villain side of things. So the chapter opens up with Dr. Ujiko in his cell talking to like this gorilla prison guard, and this is the first time that we've seen Ujiko in a very long time, I think since the war maybe, because after the war was over he was one of the significant villains to actually be arrested and in prison. And he says everything was for this moment. We had to search for so long for all those small stunted seeds worthy of being vessels. So he's referring to the process that they've been putting Shigaraki through in order to become a proper vessel for All for One. Apparently, in order for All for One to take One for All, he needs to transfer to a body that has like this unrequited hatred within it, because apparently All for One doesn't have it within himself already. And I guess the best way they thought of doing this was getting children and nurturing them to become hatred vessels, because somehow this is going to bypass the failsafe that One for All has within itself to stop it from being taken by the All for One quirk. And it makes sense, since I guess they knew this for many years. I mean, they've been crafting this plan for a very long time. So naturally, they'd have way more candidates than just Shigaraki, or Tenko Shimura, because it's going to be revealed in this chapter that little Dabi, aka Toya Todoroki, was also one of these candidates, because after he burned himself up trying to impress Endeavor on Mount Sokoto, he was somehow visited by All For One, and the way that he's dressed here pretty much confirms that he was in fact the one who dropped off Tenko to his mother, therefore giving him the decay quirk since it manifested after that. And I know I've talked about that many times in previous videos, but I'm gonna make a new video about that because I'm sure at least some of you aren't familiar with the whole All For One giving Shigaraki decay theory. But anyway, after All For One picks up little burnt up Toya, we cut to 3 years later where he wakes up inside of this makeshift orphanage place. And a lot of you have been telling me that this place looks extremely similar to the place that we see Child Overhaul at the beginning of chapter 158. And yeah, it turns out that this is pretty much the same place, which means that yeah, Overhaul was also a previous All For One hatred vessel candidate. And I'd like to also make a separate video about that because there's a lot to go into with all of that stuff. But after Dabi wakes up from his 3-year-long coma, we see that he's still Toya. He hasn't like completely lost himself yet. He's still remorseful for how he acted leading up to his final moments. And he wants to go back and see his family, but more so Endeavor because, you know, he's obsessed with him, but he wants to apologize as well. And we see this voice coming from a blank computer screen talking to him, and he pretty much tells him that you're not going to be able to go back to your family, and that because of what he did on Mount Sokoto, his body was destroyed, and that putting him back together was an extreme procedure, and that all of his partially destroyed tissue has been grafted back onto him to speed up his recovery, and that also he won't be able to use his abilities like he was before, and that he sustained grave damage in several organs, and that his somatic nervous system is impaired, meaning that pain will become duller to him, and he'll never be able to go back to how he was before. So yeah, it turns out that the aesthetic that we see Dabi have is of course a result of his own inflictions, but also because of the procedures that Ujiko performed on him. Now obviously the current Dabi that we see, or at least before this chapter, was more so of a gradual decline, and it seems like he was doing some kind of personal fixes to himself, but he essentially goes on to tell Dabi that he wanted him to join their ranks, but since he's so damaged that he's essentially a failure, reminding him of what Endeavor told him, which was like a really harsh, pragmatic way of Endeavor to try to not get Dabi to do this to himself, because he saw that, you know, he was pushing himself so much that it was eventually going to lead to this, but I guess it was all for naught, unfortunately. But then Ujiko says that he may be able to restore his firepower to as it was before, but he's going to have to partake in his classes. And this was like the breaking point for young Dabi, and he like sets the orphanage place on fire and then leaves. And it comes back to Ujiko saying it was too late to show him the way. He was too burned out already. Even him who controls everything, All For One, found it impossible to manipulate the obsession that he had for his father. And he says the reason that they let Dabi go was because of his body after waking up. It shouldn't have even lasted a month. Then going further, we see another flashback of Ujiko introducing Dabi to the high-end Nomu hood, and we're getting an extended dialogue sequence here that we weren't privy to originally, where it turns out that Dabi knows that Ujiko was the one who kept him alive. And he says, looking at that living corpse over there, hood, I can get a good solid idea of what y'all did to me back then, and that the reason he came back was because it's the perfect spot for a funeral. And then Ujiko said that one look said it all. This body that overcame even death was held together by the flames of vengeance. Then we find out that when he ran away from the orphanage place after burning it down, he did try to return home. But once he got there, he saw the memorial to him, as well as Endeavor like brutally training young Shoto. And he concluded that his family had already moved on from him, and that his life no longer had any meaning. Then we come back to the present with Dabi facing off against Shoto. And he says, when you cross certain limits, the things that used to shape you lose all meaning. I devoted myself just to make my flames stronger. I couldn't face him while being weak. And then Shoto's like, you wanted to die from the start. And Dabi says Toya died and Dabi was born. And we see him in front of the memorial. And I always thought this was a cool little nod to the name of Dabi's quirk, which is cremation. And I'm not sure if it's ever said in the series, but we do get that information in the Ultra Analysis book. Since cremation is something that is done to bodies after the funerals, as to where they're lit up inside of a furnace and reduced to ashes so that the family can keep them afterwards. So again, pretty cool of Horikoshi to have that little nugget of information hiding in plain sight this whole time. And then we see like full-blown unhinged Dabi here with his skin melted off, and we kind of just see like this burnt tissue zombie-esque form. And he says, "I'll burn everything precious to him to the ground. That will be proof that I ever existed." And we see him about to conduct a Flashfire Fist. And the reason he knows how to do this, along with the prominence burn, as well as like being able to fly via his jets from his feet, is because he says he's seen many of Endeavor's moves because over the years he watched him on TV. And then the chapter ends with Shoto saying, like, "I'm gonna let you do that." So yeah, pretty tragic story for Dabi / Toya here. I mean, we already kind of knew that when we got his initial backstory, but now that it's come full circle, it's even more tragic, but at the same time, he's kind of brought it upon himself. And yes, he could have had a better upbringing, of course, but we do see the other side of the coin with Shoto. You don't necessarily have to become a homicidal maniac. So in this chapter, we're seeing Shoto's new power-up, I guess you could say, because he's finally fully able to use the Flashfire Fist. And that is going to be like a big theme of this chapter because it further represents another dichotomy between the brothers here, Shoto and Dabi. Both of them have been trying to acquire this technique, which is like another aspect of them chasing after Endeavor. But Shoto learning this by Endeavor actually training him himself, as where Dabi, went on his own exiled path, watching Endeavor on TV and whatnot, and then adapting it that way. And the chapter actually opens up with some exposition on Flashfire Fist by saying it is performed by raising one's internal temperature and accumulating as much heat as humanly possible to then release it in an incredibly strong burst. This technique was honed by a young Endeavor, and it is considered the apex of fire moves. At the time of developing this technique, Endeavor felt like he had reached the limit of his potential. However, the heat from those flames would end up warping the future he dreamt of. And that is very true because it had. Because it says once he reached the limit of his potential, meaning he realized that he could only get so hot because his body would eventually overheat. Therefore, he felt at that limitation, he would never be able to surpass All Might, which is like his life's goal. Where most of his hero career was kind of living and performing in the shadow of All Might, always being number 2. So that's where he came up with the plan of creating an offspring that would be able to surpass All Might. So that's why he went out and found Ray, who had an ice quirk, because he felt that if he were to have a child that could have a mixture of both quirks, the ice would be able to mitigate the overheating aspect of the Flashfire Fist, therefore making them like the ultimate user of it. In that way, he thought they would be able to surpass All Might. But chasing this selfish, grandiose dream has led to this warped future, with Toya born, being told that he has more potential than Endeavor, because he technically does, as his flames can become hotter than Endeavor's. But he doesn't have the ice ability to mitigate the flames and the overheating. And Endeavor's training and overbearing pressure, and the way that he raised Toya, of course, led him to unfortunately becoming Dabi. But eventually Endeavor's plan led to Shoto being born, which further caused him to warp another child's life with Shoto. So this entire ruined family, I mean, it's not just the two brothers here. I mean, obviously we see Ray is like in a psychiatric ward, or she was. The other two siblings are, made out kind of better because they weren't what he was looking for, but still they have a ruined family. All of this is a result of one man's insecurities and selfish desires. Also guys, could you please subscribe to this channel? There's like thousands of you that consistently watch my Hero videos, but you don't subscribe. And if you don't want to because I'm not good enough or whatever, I totally understand that. But if you just didn't think about it and you do want to subscribe now that I brought it up, then could you please do that? Thanks, guys. But we further see Dabi attacking Shoto, and Shoto says at this rate which he's raising his temperature up is not normal. He's getting so hot that he's further melting the All Might statue, which goes back to how he always had more potential than Endeavor to become hotter than him. But even at this point, Shoto is still able to fight against him due to the proprietary technique that he's come up with, which we'll go into. And he's like, I'll be the one who stops you. But then Dabi's like, don't get it twisted. I've been preparing for years for the day I'll murder you. It all began from the moment I tried to regain my power. All I knew was how to ramp up my heat." And then he replays what Endeavor told him in his mind, saying, "You've got more talent than me." And he's like, "Those words made me feel like I could do anything." And then we see Dabi activate his own Flashfire Fist, something that Endeavor didn't really want to teach him, because he knew that Dabi had even a weaker constitution for the fire than he did, and he didn't want Toya to kill himself because of this. And he goes on to activate his own Hell Spider. We've seen Endeavor do this before, especially against the Hayanomu. Speaking of that, we see a lot of parallels to that fight in this chapter as well. He used the Hell Spider as a distraction, and he winds up behind Shoto. And he's like, "How did you have the patience to stay housed with all of those pathetic civilians while what was going on? Have you no shame at all, Shoto? You had the perfect body, the perfect training environment, and then you chose to cling to others? You'll never become a hero." And he like blasts Dabi with a jet burn, another thing that we've seen Endeavor do against the Hayanomu. But even similar to that, he also hits Shoto into a building. This is like an incredible sequence, and the anime, I just hope, does justice to it. But then Dabi realizes that he neutralized all of that heat, which goes back to the proprietary technique I was talking about that's revealed that Shoto developed specifically for Dabi. And we get a flashback of Shoto talking to Endeavor, and Endeavor says, "Among all the remaining heroes, you're the only one who can stand against him right now," meaning Dabi. Just like how Midoriya is the only one who could stop Shigaraki, you're going to have to stop him. And then he says to Dabi, "Yes, our house was hell, and yeah, our father was insane, but you're the one that decided to walk the path of murder," which is of course another dichotomy of the brothers. Both victims of circumstance, both brought up through abuse, but it ultimately didn't mean that they had to lead the path of Dabi. They didn't have to become a psychopath. Although Shoto wasn't on a good path when we were first introduced to him in the series, he eventually came around once he was able to get new friends with Class 1A, or specifically Izuku. It goes back to what Dabi said earlier about you chose to cling to others, something that Dabi didn't do because he chose to, be like an exiled psychopath instead. We see Shoto in his full-blown Flashfire Fist mode, and he has like the flame X across his chest, which is similar to what Endeavor has. And his hair is like Super Saiyan-esque, almost looks like it's frozen in a way. And then he says, "Don't you ever again dare to steal lives of people who had nothing to do with your own downfall. Take it all out on us instead." And he hits Dabi with his new move called Phosphorus. And this, I guess, so far seems to be Shoto's like ultimate move. Obviously it's not like the prominence burn, and it doesn't seem to be incorporating ice, at least from what I could see, but it does seem like this is overpowering Dabi for sure. And I don't know if this is necessarily like going to be the finishing blow to him, but the way that this sequence is playing out, it very well maybe. Because also, throughout this fight, Dabi has been melting himself. Like, he almost completely has no skin left. He's kind of like a fiery Nomu zombie. So this very likely could be like the end of this fight, and Dabi is defeated. I don't know if this is going to kill Dabi, but man, it just seems very unlikely that he's going to survive at this point. So coming off of the previous chapter, we saw Shoto being able to use his own Flashfire Fist and hit Dabi with a phosphor attack. And that's kind of where it ended. And picking up on this chapter, we're seeing a flashback to the student dormitory before this big final battle started. And Shoto's talking to Izuku about the very battle at hand, because Izuku is, kind of worried about Shoto taking on Dabi. And Shoto's like, "No need to worry about me. I made my decision. Father won't be able to keep his promise, but that'll be his punishment." I guess he's referring back to, I think, chapter 303, when Endeavor was in the hospital with Shoto and they were talking to Hawks and Best Jeanist. And I guess Endeavor was basically saying like, "Hey, I promised to take down Dabi." And as we see in this case, he's not going to be able to do that because Shoto will be the one doing that, because Endeavor is included in the team helping to take down All for One. But I guess in his own little way, he is helping by instructing Shoto to go after him individually, also supplying him with his sidekicks. So there's that. But then Shoto goes on to reveal to Izuku his own proprietary Flashfire Fist, the thing that we saw him use at the end of the previous chapter. And Izuku says it looks almost like Flashfire Fist, but there's something different about it. And then we see like Kaminari poking it, and he says, this isn't hot at all. And Shoto says training and maintaining is incredibly difficult, so it ends up fizzling out. But the secret to the technique is using his freezing left half and his burning right half at the same time. And using his heart as the center focus, he can manifest it. So cold and warm blood circulate through his body, resulting in a thermal equilibrium. It's something like cold fire. Then he goes on to say that Endeavor wanted him to reduce his body's internal temperature by introducing ice as like a coolant. So Shoto decided to essentially do the opposite here. And this is really important to Shoto because he's like discovering himself with this. Because he says like, only I could find out the reason I was born in that house. And he goes on to say like, this is my power. Meaning that yes, like his life is an unfortunate result of Endeavor's crazy plan of trying to surpass All Might as the #1 hero by vicariously living through his greatest child. But he's been trying to break away from that and develop his own identity, and with this he has done that. And this is like one of Shoto's big final character arcs, something that he's been struggling with essentially the entire series. And since this is the final arc, this is the time where this is going to be blossoming. By the way guys, if you'd like my hero review videos, please subscribe if you haven't already. A lot of you consistently watch them, but you don't subscribe, so maybe you just need to be reminded. So here you go. Thanks guys. So then he hits Dabi with a freezing impact burning ice blade, and this seems to legitimately affect Dabi because in response he says he has a body able to withstand my flash fire along with ice to quench my flames. Well, aren't you just the man for this job? Going back to what Shoto was saying in the previous chapter about how he developed this ability specifically for Dabi, but then Dabi kind of rebounds and Shoto's like, he neutralized it, I just need to find an opening again. And then Dabi puts his hands on the ground and starts shooting all of these fire pillars out of the ground and goes into another monologue. And he's like, even if we're bound by blood, we're nothing alike. Once you stray from the right path, there's no turning back. This is the side effect of superhuman society. We are the absolute limit. Then before his fire pillars are able to hit Shoto, Burnin jumps in front of him and takes the hit for him. Since her quirk is based in fire, she's more applicable to taking this than Shoto, who says those flames were hot enough to have burnt me for sure. And he thanks her. We go into an inner monologue with Shoto, and he says, my blood, my past. It was a lonely existence with almost nothing to look back on or forward to. By the time I finally understood that it wasn't the case, everyone seemed like they were always so far ahead of me, when in reality, they were always beside me. Every member from Class A was there for me. They always gave me a place to feel safe. And then he remembers back to that interview practice that Mount Lady was giving everyone, I think in chapter 241, when she said, your ultimate moves symbolize you. It's through those moves that people learn what you're capable of. So I guess this is the other character arc that Shoto is going to be having in this chapter. Finally coming full circle, and I guess him fully understanding who he is as a person finally. Not only through his abilities and birthright, but also just as a person and the relationships that he's developed, which shows how far he's come since the beginning of the series when he was very cold and standoffish and maybe felt that he was going to have to live this lonely life. So yeah, this is kind of like friendship power up, but at the same time, you know, we've seen this many times before in many different series, even in the whole inner monologue with him like seeing his friends in like a dark hallway or something. But I would say it makes more sense for Shoto, if anyone, to have this enlightenment because it has been like a big aspect of his character, and this was like the final push that he needed to go into his ultimate attack, which we're going to see in the final moments of this chapter here, where he goes on to tell Dabi that there is turning back, even if it is by force. This is in reference to what Dabi said earlier when he was like, once you stray from the right path, there's no turning back. Further showing the dichotomy of the brothers here. And as he's connecting his ultimate attack with Dabi, he says, so please just stop all of this. And then he hits him with the Great Arctic Tsunami. And this is like a massive attack that seems to be affecting like portions of the city for sure, because we see like the buildings and the area all around completely frozen. And as this is happening, we see a glimpse of like their child forms, like Dabi when he was little Toya and Shoto when he was younger as well. And this parallels to when Izuku was encountering Shigaraki and we saw a glimpse of both of their child forms. And I guess this is like the recurring theme of the villains. They are all currently like a byproduct of their youths, unfortunately. And in a way, this could be like the heroes heroes saving the inherent innocent child that they were once. And in the final panel, we see Shoto like propping up, I guess, unconscious Dabi, who's partially frozen. And the narration says, unleashed beyond his limits, he finally quells his brother's flames. So I guess this is the end of the fight, right? And Shoto has defeated Dabi. No, I don't know if it's going to straight up end in this chapter and we're going to go to something else, but if we do continue this into the next chapter, I'm not sure if Dabi is going to be conscious, but if he is, maybe we'll see him come around, because it goes back to Shoto saying there is turning back, even if it is by force, so please just stop all of this. I mean, this is my hero after all, so Dabi very well could have a 180, or this shows him the light possibly, even though it seemed like Dabi was destined to die, or he was just on this crazy death path, because he is completely unhinged at this point and his body is wrecked. Like, he looks like a Titan from Attack on Titan. But maybe this was enough to snap him out of it and make him realize, like, hey, you know what, I can change at this point. Maybe it isn't too late, but we'll see what happens with that. Let me know what you think about this chapter in the comments, guys, and if you like the video, please give it a like and please subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.